Okay, hi guys. So for my in-depth reporting presentation, I decided to cover a story by ProPublica, which is a nonprofit newsroom that typically does investigative journalism. If you haven't read any of their pieces, I definitely suggest it because I had a very hard time choosing which one to cover because they're all, in my opinion, good examples of in-depth reporting, especially in-depth investigative reporting. So the one that I chose is titled "The Climate Solution Actually Adding Millions of Tons of CO2 into the Atmosphere." So here I've kind of broken down different parts of the story that I chose, as well as I kind of wrote out before I began reading what I thought a good in-depth story would contain, especially an investigative in-depth story. And I came out with the analysis of documents and data, utilizing hard to find records, formed hypothesis, making a secret public, holding companies or parties involved accountable, answering fundamental questions, and utilizing media graphics and graphs. So to kind of explain each one, the analysis of documents and data. So it's super important, especially in journalism, because I believe it was Moss Brennan that said in his when he spoke to our class that we read at or people read these stories at the level of a fifth grader, or most of America reads at the level of a fifth grader. So you have to make these stories easy to understand and easy to read, especially with so much data and documents that are hard to read. And this especially goes with this story because there are a lot of numbers and difficult concepts to kind of break down. So I think it's extremely important to have an analysis of the different documents and data that you're using so that your reader will understand and read more and actually understand what you're trying to say or the story you're trying to convey. So, utilizing hard to find records, again, I think that this is a pretty important aspect of in depth investigative reporting, especially because when you're utilizing these hard to find records, you're showing the reader that, oh, you did your research, you know what you're talking about, you found records that, you or I could probably not find. And again, going back up to analyzing it, it's important to analyze those hard to find records and explaining, how you got them, what they mean. So, forming a hypothesis is, I think, extremely important. You're forming a theory and then you're backing it up with facts and data, and again, documents that support that hypothesis. Making a secret public. This one isn't as important with just a general in-depth story, but especially with the piece I chose, an investigative piece. It's important that you're trying to convey to the public a story that is, secret or that has not been uncovered that's important to society. And so making this secret public is important because it opens people's eyes, it encourages people to go out and do something about it. And then it also shows readers that what they're reading isn't some kind of propaganda, it's something actually being uncovered. So going back up to making the secret public, and then going down to holding companies and parties involved accountable, it's important that when you're making a secret public, you're holding people that are involved accountable and demonstrating who it was, what they did, as to the best of your ability, because most of the time people aren't going to want to, answer your questions or be involved. But um, answer fundamental questions. This goes back up to analyzing documents and data. You need to answer, what does this mean for society as a whole? What does this mean, in this story's case, what does this mean for the climate? What does this in general mean? Who does this affect? Those questions are important to, answer because that's probably what a reader is looking for. They want to know what everything means. What is your story trying to tell? Who is it affecting? I think that's probably the most important question, is who is it affecting? And then of course, utilization of media graphics and graphs. I think one of the most important parts of in-depth storytelling is giving some kind of visual, because a lot of people, need a graph or a drawing or just anything, a picture, to kind of explain what these hard to read numbers and data and information means. So So for an introduction, the climate solution actually adding millions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere was published by ProPublica and written by Lisa Song and James Temple. So just to kind of stop myself there, Lisa Song and James Temple were both, written there at the top. I'm not sure which one wrote the majority of it. I believe it was Lisa Song, and maybe James Temple helped review it or helped, research. I'm not sure. But it was also reviewed by MIT Tech. ProPublica is an independent and nonprofit newsroom that generates investigative journalism that will interest the public. So going back up to where it says reviewed by MIT Tech, I think it's important to say this story does a really good job of explaining things at times. But at the very bottom of the story, there is a large paragraph or a large kind of splurge about what the numbers mean, how they found the numbers, what, a carbon is. It explains everything you need to know so that you can read the story coherently and actually understand. So this story is about an offset program that allows forest owners to receive carbon credits if they take care of their forest in ways that store more carbon so that it is not released into the atmosphere. So reducing logging and thinning out areas. If you own land that contains more carbon than the regional average, you get credits for the difference. Many companies have begun to cherry pick or take the most beneficial pieces of land so that they're able to obtain more credits and money. So to kind of round out what that last sentence says, most companies, which is what the article is about, companies cherry picking and kind of defeating the purpose of the offset program, and people receiving actual carbon credits. So this program was designed so that people that own a large amount of, forest land would be given carbon credits, it has monetary value. To what extent, I'm not 100% sure. That was a little confusing to me, but they receive carbon credits if they take care of this land by maintaining logging, making sure it's not happening as much, and then thinning out areas so that carbon isn't released as often. And so these larger companies have begun to come in and buy these pieces of land that don't have as much forestry on them. So they don't have to, log the amount that's being logged or or when they go to log that something is being thinned out, it's technically a lie because there's not much to thin out. And they're receiving all of these carbon credits. And with these carbon credits, these companies are able to use them and emit even more greenhouse gases through their company into the air because of the carbon credit. And the way that the land is, looked at and the amount of forestry, it's all the same. There's not really a science behind, oh, this land has more, so they'll get more carbon credits, and this land has less, so they'll get less. It's all averaged the same way. And that's why these companies are able to cherry pick and kind of game the system. So my next couple of slides are going back to my first slide about the different, qualities of in-depth reporting. And so this first one is the analysis of documents and data. So the story does a good job of explaining what a carbon credit is, and the monetary value of credits. So I listed the monetary value of credits here, and that was one thing that stood out to me that I didn't think really made sense. Although they do a good job of explaining what a carbon credit is, they don't really go into, the monetary value of that credit or how it's going to give someone more money. It simply talks about other companies being able to emit more gas, which I guess is them making more money because they're able to do, more with their company. So boundary cherry picking, it does a good job of explaining kind of what I was just talking about. People are cherry picking what lands they want so that they are making more carbon credits, and all the boundaries are pretty much averaged the same. It does a good job explaining carbon per acre, which I'm pretty sure at the end of my slide, I'm going to show you the graph and then graphics that the article utilized, and that'll kind of explain more the carbon per acre idea. Carbon in local versus regional boundaries. Again, it does a good job of kind of explaining, going back to the boundaries, like where you'll receive the most carbon credits, where you won't receive the most carbon credits, and then the percentage of credits that do or do not represent carbon reduction, and the percentage of forest loggings. And with the percentage of credits that do or do not represent carbon reduction, it's simply saying, these people are giving these credits and they're actually, reducing carbon emissions, while these people are receiving credits that do not reduce carbon emissions. So going back to forming a hypothesis, I think that the journalist did a really good job of forming a theory and then using facts and data to back that theory. So the author of this article forms a hypothesis, which is the fact that many companies are gaming the system so that they can gain more credits and emit more carbon or greenhouse gases. The author then proves this theory by utilizing many different sources and data. For example, the policy director at Carbon Plan said that the offset project is increasing the amount of gas being put into the atmosphere. The researchers of Carbon Plan have analyzed data that shows the level of excess crediting and the number of projects in one specific area that points to gaming the system. The journalist found facts to support their hypothesis and went in depth to report it, much like a detective would. And I say here, much like a detective would, I put that in there because I think with in-depth storytelling, you really have to dive deep into the material that you're working with, and you have to research further than simply interviewing the first people that pop up into your search engine whenever you're researching a specific story. So here I've included a quote. Sylvia Teres Pariza said that the landowners and project developers will continue to respond to the incentives created in the program in ways that overstate climate progress until the program itself changes. And I'm using this quote to kind of demonstrate the way that it's important to reveal a secret. And here the author is utilizing her sources or their sources to explain this secret and, show that this secret is allowing people to continue to do these things and, pollute the earth. And that the program itself needs to change, which again advocates for a specific cause, which in investigative reporting, especially in ProPublica's case, is good. So here I kind of listed a couple of people or companies that did not want to respond to comments or decline to respond to comments or questions. So again, the author is holding society accountable by putting in their story, I reached out to these people and I asked these people about them emitting more carbon into the air by gaming the project, the offset program. And I think that in itself is a lot more powerful than not including it at all. So here, Alaska Project, James Erler, New Forest, Dave Clergen, Finite Carbon received no response for questions, or they declined to answer any questions. And I believe Dr. Perot has mentioned before, if somebody doesn't want to talk to you, that's fine. Tell them, hey, you don't want to respond to me, that's okay, but I'm going to put this in my story. And I think that speaks for itself a lot louder than using some lie that they say in a quote like, oh, no, we would never do that. I think that people not wanting to answer your questions shows a lot more about their character and what they're doing behind closed doors than, again, them lying about it. And, there's 5 here, but I'm pretty sure it's a very, very long article. I definitely recommend going and reading it because it's very informative, and it shocked me to know that this was happening. But I'm pretty sure that there are a lot more people that the author included that did not want to talk about what was going on. Okay, so going back to answering fundamental questions. So it's important to answer questions because most of the time when somebody is reading your piece, your article, they have these questions popping up in their head like, oh, why does this affect me? Like, why is this happening? How did this happen? What does it mean? What does it mean for other people involved? So I think a good element of in-depth reporting is making sure that your reader understands why what they are reading is relevant to them, because most people, I don't want to call people selfish that, put down an article or put down a newspaper because it doesn't mean anything to their life or pertain to their life. But, in a sense, it's selfish to not explain why this matters to people. And it's also selfish to, put something down because it doesn't pertain to you. So it's really important to explain to people why it's important and why they should be reading it. So the why and the how of the story. The author explains that companies and parties are cherry picking areas. These people that are gaming the system are receiving more credit, which enables them to emit more gas. So this why and how is explaining to people that, they are doing this because the regional averages, they're not averaged the same way, and companies are understanding this more and more. So they're taking that to their advantage, and they are picking areas with less forestry and then earning more carbon credits, which then allows them to emit more gas, more pollution, which completely, again, deters the entire process of reducing carbon emissions. What does this mean? So those credits allow companies to emit even more CO2 into the atmosphere than they already are, often near poor neighborhoods. And this points towards the fact that, you're reading this is why it matters. This CO2 is being emitted near poor neighborhoods. This is happening in, maybe your neighborhood. Companies are profiting from pollution, completely destroying the purpose of the program. Going back to what I just said, they're making money from this pollution, and they are completely aware of it. And it's, again, destroying the purpose of the program, and it is destroying the purpose of, reversing climate change and pollution. What does it mean for the involved? Continue pollution until more incentives occur to correct the damage. More money than those that are actually trying to upkeep their forest and carbon emissions. So again, the averages are the same, and people that have more forestry and are taking better care of these areas to make sure the carbon isn't emitted, they're making less, carbon credits, or making less money, or however you want to look at that. Again, I'm not 100% sure the monetary value and what that means, but I do know that these companies that are cherry picking and that are picking these areas with less trees are making a lot more money by polluting the area rather than preventing pollution and carbon emissions. Okay, so now I'm going to pull up the article and kind of show the graphs and the media that was used in the story. But actually, before I do that, I'm going to again kind of talk about what could have been different about the article. It was hard for me to pick out what could have been different because, again, it was a very, very, very good story. Everything was in depth. Everything was explained. There were probably over 25 sources used, all well-rounded sources that had the necessary credentials to be talking about this subject, which is extremely important. You want to make sure you're utilizing the correct resources and sources especially for stories like this, people who know what they're talking about. One thing that stood out to me the most, though, was, again, going back to the monetary value, it did a good job of explaining, what a carbon credit was and why it mattered and what the program was and what was happening. But as far as the monetary value and explaining what was going to be done or if it was still being talked about, I didn't get much of that. I didn't really comprehend what monetary value meant when they were talking about it. Of course, that means money, but in what sense are people earning money from carbon credits other than these big companies that are able to emit more carbon? And then also another thing that I forgot to mention that I think is really important when writing large stories, especially in-depth stories, is subheadings, which I'm sure an editor would tell you. It's important to put subheadings in each different section of what you're talking about, because I myself, it was a very, very long story and I had to go back multiple times to read different areas to kind of take a pause, a mental break. And the subheadings really helped me categorize what exactly I was reading, what I was about to read, and kind of summarizing what it was in a sense. So I think subheadings are important. Maybe not for a 500 word piece, but definitely for a like 10 page, even a 5-page story. So I'm going to go to the story. So this is the first graph that that is introduced in the story. And it says how California's forest carbon offset rules allow inflated climate benefits. And so the graph here, it shows the average metric tons of CO2 per acre. And you can see that along the coastal region is where most of that CO2 is. And in the inland region is where, there's less CO2 or CO2. So then you keep scrolling and it kind of pulls up. This is super neat. I like how they do this. It kind of makes you stop looking at it and it explains what's going on. So the regional average for mixed conifer forest in the inland region is much lower than the average for similar forests in the coastal region. The inland region was created by combining 3 different ecological regions as defined by the U.S. Forest Service, some of which have far higher carbon levels than others. Most of the Northern California's offset projects are clustered along the western edge of the inland region, where projects are more likely to benefit from inflated credits. So all other forest offset right here along the coastal region, the black dots, and then over here on the outside, but projects in an area prone to overcrediting. All of these projects and these companies are right here in the yellow, where the yellow dots are. And that's kind of explaining, they're in these areas with less metric tons of CO2, while these are on the outside where there's more. And they're the ones that are gaining more credit, which does not make any sense. And this graph does a great job of explaining it. It even changes the colors for you. It has moving pieces to it, which is nice. And then I thought that this was really cool. So this is a Understanding Forest Offsets, an illustrated interlude starring Connor O'Brien. So I thought that this was really cool. It helped me at this point in the story, I was like, I'm not sure what's going on because it is a lot of information. And typically I'm not like that. But again, with certain stories, a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of research being thrown at you, it's very hard to understand if you don't go back and read it 3 or 4 times. And it's hard to find the time to do that. So I thought that it was really, really cool that they provided this very simplistic graphic that I'm just going to slow through. And each one you'll see at the bottom has an explanation of what's going on, but I'm not going to read that. You can go back and look at that if you like. But yeah, so it's just like a really simple drawing with, again, captions at the bottom explaining it. And I thought that the graphics were super cute, and they do a great job of like simplistically explaining what, it means to kind of game the system and utilize carbon credits to your advantage. So I'm just going to go through that quickly. Yep. And then at the bottom, there's another graph right here. So the Yurok tribe worked with New Forest to develop a 7,660 acre offset project on the eastern side of its land. Again, it does a good job of kind of explaining what is being said next to it. I really like that while it's being talked about, it's right next to the graph. I think that's helpful. And then this isn't necessarily anything helpful, but I thought that it was really cool that they were providing kind of wavy graphics like this. I thought that those were fun. But as you can see, it's a very long story. Here are the headings that I was talking about, the subheadings, which I think were super helpful at breaking it up. And another thing that I think is important, especially with multimedia pieces, especially with in-depth reporting, when you're throwing a lot of research and websites and just information at people. I'm not going to click on them because each one takes you to a different thing and it's just a mess, and I'm trying to scroll to the bottom. But if you click on each of these, there's a lot throughout here, as you can see. Each one takes you to another article, to research, to a website that explains exactly what's being said, or that references something else. And I think that that's super useful. It especially shows that, this person knows what they are researching and what they're talking about. And then here's what I wanted to show you all. So this right here at the bottom, it shows how we calculated offset credits and their monetary value, how we put together our maps, how we got the story. I think that's really cool that they do that because, I was wondering, like, how did you even figure this story out? Like who discovered this? Like, it's a really interesting story. It's alarming, and it's definitely a need to read kind of thing. And it was just surprising that they were able to find this. And so they explained that there. And then they explain how they put together their maps and then how they calculated offset credits and their monetary value, which is super helpful. Which again, I think that the monetary value part should be somewhere in the story, especially because you're reading over and over what a carbon credit is, what the monetary value is, and it would just be helpful to know from the get-go kind of what's going on. And then also, before I end this, I thought it was really cool, kind of like how we do with our feature stories. They start off like the first couple of paragraphs going in depth about, like descriptive imagery about the forest. And I thought that was really nice as someone who, loves imagery and kind of dives into a story with imagery. It kind of helped me acclimate myself to what I was reading about and prepare myself for the information I was about to take in. So, like, for example, it says soaring redwoods and Douglas firs dominate these thick, wet woodlands, creating a canopy hundreds of feet high. I just thought that was a beautiful description. And it kind of sets you up for what's about to happen. And yeah, so that was the climate solution, actually adding millions of tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. And kind of to go back and summarize, again, I think in-depth storytelling is the analysis of documents and data, utilizing hard to find records, forming your hypothesis and backing that up with facts, making public or secret public, and then holding the companies or parties involved with that secret accountable for what they're doing and how it's affecting others. Answering fundamental questions, and then utilizing media, graphics, and graphs for the hard to understand moments of the story. So yeah, thank you guys so much. Can't wait to talk about it in class. I hope you guys come up with some great questions. I will try to answer to the best of my ability, because again, this was a complicated story. If you find yourself having enough time and want to read about, climate solution and things like that, I would definitely recommend going and reading this. So yeah, thank you.